Hey guys, it's Dr. Salcedo. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for another third session of Conscious Motherhood. I'm so excited to share this video with you because it will get into the difficulties that some of us have with changing our habits. So maybe you created some SMART goals and you're just really struggling with it, and that it will maybe lend to why it might be hard to give up certain habits like sugar habits or that daily Starbucks habit that we have, or why we need to have a piece of bread every morning. Those kinds of things can lead into addiction, which can be like a four-letter word. Like I don't want anyone to feel like we're going to try to shame anyone, but addiction's a real thing. And a lot of the most functional people we know have struggles with alcoholism or drugs. But really, what I'm going to get into here is some sugar addictions, which can be really challenging to look at because a lot of times that we think of sugar addiction as like candy and things, but when we start to consider a low carb lifestyle, we're going to be confronted with a withdrawal effect that our body has been used to of having carbohydrates over and over and over. And remember, it's this chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption that leads to inflammation and high insulin levels that damage our blood vessels, that impact our ability to conceive, but also carry a healthy pregnancy. And that's really all it is. So I want to teach you why addiction can play a role in this. And so we're going to go ahead and share the screen so that we can talk about how sugar addiction plays a role in our motherhood. So I'm going to give you a questionnaire online, and I want you to get a piece of paper and answer these questions privately. You don't have to share with me, or if you want to, you can. Please share in the comments if you want to. But I know that a lot of these questions that I got are from the Eat Better South Africa program that help women with low carb lifestyle in a South African population. So thank you to Dr. Georgia, my colleagues over at the Nutrition Network, and the Noakes Foundation for their help in some of these questionnaires that we're using today. So, first question, what is your typical breakfast like? So, remember, these questions are going to help us understand what our patterns are with addiction. So, A, scrambled eggs with vegetables, avocado toast, or even last night's leftovers. B, Greek yogurt, oatmeal with fruit, or a smoothie. Or C, a cereal, a muffin, a bagel with cream cheese, or even a breakfast bar. The next question, how much sugar or sweetener do you add to your coffee? A, none. B, a teaspoon or one packet. Or C, two teaspoons or two packets at least. Next question. How often do you go out of your way to get something sugary, like stopping at the store to buy a candy or a sweetened Starbucks drink? Now, for me, this was pretty frequently before I started changing my lifestyle. So no judgment here. A, almost never. B, every once in a while if I get a crazy craving for something. Or C, often, like once a week. And for me, this actually used to be every day. Next, do you eat sugary foods secretively? A, no. If I'm having a dessert, it's part of a meal or an event with others, kind of like Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? B, a couple of times a year, I feel like finishing off a pint of ice cream on the couch by myself. Yeah, I can understand that. A lot of times people have stressful situations and they indulge to create a lot of dopamine to make us feel better. We'll get into that. Or C, I usually wait to eat dessert when I'm alone so I can really eat without anyone judging me. Next question. Do you hide sugary foods to eat them later? A, no. Why would I do that? B, not usually, but if I know there's one or more piece of Aunt Millie's amazing pie left, I might rearrange a few things in the refrigerator to make it harder for anyone else to find. Or C, yeah, I have a stash of favorites to enjoy by myself. Do you ever feel powerless in front of sugary foods or foods made of refined flour like white bread. Rarely, it's just not my thing. B, maybe once in a while if I'm starving, but I usually can eat one or two one or two cookies and then stop. C, yeah, usually us if I start eating stuff like that, it's really hard to stop even when I'm already full. Well, indulging, do you ever tell yourself this is the last time you'll ever eat like this? A, no. B, I tried once or twice in the past to cut out sugar, but I realized it wouldn't work in the long run. Or C, I tell myself that a lot and then end up feeling bad when I don't follow through. So, how did that go? I mean, that obviously you can kind of see the pattern. The A's are definitely someone who's not struggling with sugar addiction, and the C's are people who kind of dip in and out. And then the C's are people who, by and large, are probably having sugar addiction in their life in some way, shape, or form. So, before we go any further, and I know we talk a lot about what carbs are, right? And fat and protein, but like we've not really actually ever named it. We've actually not really defined these things. And so these macronutrients, which are not like vitamins, okay, these are not like vitamin A or omegas or things that I'm like, actual vitamins, which are called micronutrients. Macronutrients are the umbrella term for how we get our vitamins. Okay. So carbohydrates is one way to attain sugar in our body, and that comes from bread and flour and fruit. And so those are all carbohydrates, pasta, beans, rice, potatoes. Proteins are actual structures that come from cheese, um, animal proteins, beef, seafood. This is a vital nutrient. If we don't consume protein, then our body will go into crisis, okay? And so a lot of folks who lean more plant-based kind of struggle to get enough protein, and they're always kind of searching for plant-based proteins. Now, a lot of them are very high in starch, and so beans, although there is some protein in that it's more starch, and a lot of this starch, unfortunately, of people who are struggling with insulin resistance or their body type has a hard time processing starchy proteins, they end up even more worse off, and they end up with prediabetes or diabetes or inflammatory disorders because they cannot possibly consume enough legumes in order to meet the protein requirement that our body needs. So proteins, by and large, come from animal proteins, dairy, seafoods, and that really does give us the nutritious things that we need. Proteins are not carbohydrates, but if we eat too much protein, as we break them down, they can turn into carbohydrates in our system. And fat. Fat is our different oils and cholesterols that come from fruits like avocado, from nuts, from things like tallow and lard and butter and olives. Those are all sources of incredible sources of fat that our body needs because fat is the building block for all of our hormones. It's the way we can attain cholesterol. And cholesterol is the building block for all of our female hormones. And so if we don't eat cholesterol, if we don't eat fatty things, our body will automatically be in crisis and will be in no shape in order to create a pregnancy, create a healthy pregnancy because we need fat for our neurologic buffers. We need fat for our neurons to create good synapses and connections in our brain develop, the baby's brain development. We need fat for our cell layers, and so that like the cell layers can move well in between the different cells and stuff. And if we don't have fat, that those lubricating substances won't be there in order to create cells. And cells are the building blocks for our entire body. So these macronutrients, a lot of people will say, and nutritional sources will say, you need all three. But that's actually incorrect. You do not need carbohydrates to live because your body can make fuel sources of carbohydrates from protein, and fat is a way better source of energy than carbohydrates ever were. And many of our healthcare providers who are watching this will probably remember in biochemistry that the amount of ATP that comes from fat is actually way more than that comes from the TCA cycle in carbohydrates. So just keep that in mind. Now, if we understand our body's ability to consume our macronutrients of protein and fat, the best way we can understand that is how we are able to drink water. So when we're thirsty, we really don't know how much water our body is going to need when we have a glass of water. We just know that when we drink a glass of water or a bottle of water when we're thirsty, our brain automatically tells us to stop drinking when we have satiated that thirst center in our brain. Okay, so no one really knows unless you really force yourself to drink a whole glass of water. There's something in our brain, it's called the satiety center, that tells us stop drinking water. It's a thirst center. It tells us to stop. Now, our satiety centers are present for fat, protein, and water, but there's no satiety center in our brain for carbohydrates. That actually comes from stretch receptors and hormones in our stomach that tell us we are done eating because we cannot possibly add any more food into our stomach and we've stretched it out, and that's what tells us to stop. That happens from carbohydrates because we've consumed so much it stretches our stomach. But that doesn't happen with fat, protein, and water. Only in our brain do we get these signals that tell us to stop eating fat, protein, and water. Now, carbohydrate addiction comes from when carbohydrates actually stimulate addiction centers in our brain. So, carbohydrates don't stimulate the satiety centers, they actually stimulate the addiction centers in our brain, just like cocaine does and alcohol, all of those things that cause addiction from our brain. And most of us kind of understand, like tobacco, nicotine, same place in our brain with carbohydrates. Now, for example, if we are talking about alcohol addiction, what happens in that addiction cycle is that we drink alcohol, it gives us some pleasure. Then, once we stop drinking alcohol, we have this moment of withdrawal where we're like, huh, okay, our brain is starting to withdraw from having that source of alcohol that caused pleasure. That is the moment where we start to feel more cravings. And this is the choice point, my friends. This is the point where we say, I am done drinking alcohol for the day, or I'm going to add more to fulfill that craving. And a lot of times it has to do with the trigger. So maybe we poured ourselves a glass of wine from a bottle. And if we see the trigger of more alcohol in that bottle and we have craving, we allow ourselves to pour more. But if we had a glass of alcohol, of wine from a bottle of wine, and we poured ourselves one glass and put the bottle away from our sight, then we might not feel as triggered to drink more with that second glass. And we know the second glass matters, that's for sure. If we frame that in terms of sugar addiction, for example, if we have a cookie, we eat sugar, it gives us pleasure by activating dopamine receptors in our brain. And then we get a withdrawal once we're done eating the cookie and we're like, maybe we need another one. And we start to crave it. Now, that is the choice point where we can decide to eat another cookie or stop. And so that is where, like, if we are at our friend's house and having dinner, or it's Thanksgiving and there's a plate of cookies in front of us, we actually have to tell our brain to stop eating cookies unless we're already so full we can't possibly eat anymore. So remember, that point is called the choice point, and that choice point will tell us, can give us the moment of how am I going to go? Am I going to go in the direction of a negative choice or a positive choice? That is the most important spot in addiction cycling. Now, when we talk about the addiction cycle, we eat sugar, we like it. Now, biochemically, what happens is we get a blood sugar spike and dopamine is released, which is the feel-good hormone in our brain that makes us feel happy when we eat sugar. Then our insulin is secreted from our pancreas. The insulin that's secreted from our pancreas decreases that blood sugar because it brings the glucose to storage. And then that lower blood sugar causes the craving. And then that low blood sugar causes that appetite for more craving and more engagement of whatever carbohydrate that's in front of us. And we just keep going and going. Now, what happens though is that if our belly gets too full, then we stop eating, mostly because we can't possibly eat anymore, and we get the food coma, which is called the Randall cycle. But really, it's trying to remember and notice where that cycle is. And some people, it just causes that crazy dopamine release and that hit, and we just can't control it. So, this is the hormone. This is the feel-good hormone. This is the dopamine that causes that addictive feeling once you have too much of a good thing. Now, if I were to put a piece of steak in front of you, now this ribeye looks incredible, right? Now, if I gave you this steak and nothing else, so not even like the garlic or the peppers or tomatoes in front of you, and I said, go ahead and eat it. It's hard to know how much a person might eat because what will happen, this is just pure protein and fat, guys. And so if I gave you pure protein and fat, we know that your satiety center in your brain will tell you to stop eating regardless of your if you're physically full. When your body has received the correct amount of protein and fat that it needs for its biologic requirement, it will tell you to stop eating. Which that's why if I gave you a stick of butter, you could, and I said, eat the whole thing. You could not. Because if you had a bite of that, you'd probably, your body would say, oh, that's enough fat. I don't need any more. I have enough now for my biologic requirement. The same thing with protein and steak and fat and steak. Your body will, you might be able to eat the whole thing. You might not, but it won't be because you're so stuffed. It'll be because your brain told you to stop. Now, going back to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are not essential. Remember, there is no brain hormonal feedback control. All the only hormonal control is that there is the dopamine receptors in your brain, and the decrease in the insulin or in the carbohydrates concentration from insulin will activate the craving again. And so carbohydrates are not essential to our biology. We can get them from proteins. We can use energy from ketones and fat metabolism. So carbohydrates like bread, rice, beans, potatoes, pasta are not essential. There is no satiety center in our brain that tells us to stop eating carbohydrates when we have met our biologic requirement. And that's because there is no biologic requirement for carbohydrates. So, what is the effect of sugar on our body? Well, eating too much sugar can cause metabolic dysfunction, metabolic syndrome that we talked about. Metabolic syndrome is the gateway to all of these cardiovascular disease complications, including pregnancy complications. So, obesity, high triglycerides, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, mental health problems. There's a lot of great data to show that when people stop eating carbohydrates, their depression goes away. High blood pressure, high uric acid levels, which leads to gout, insulin resistance, heart disease, and we should add their pregnancy complications. Now, as we getting to our close, when we have these cravings, it's important to understand whether the craving is in front of us is a physical craving or an emotional craving. Okay. Now, a physical craving means that something that we need in order to fulfill our biologic requirements. It's a gradual craving. So if we haven't eaten breakfast in the morning and we're fat adapted, eventually we'll feel open to food, but we're not starving. We're not hangry. It's open to all food. So if I said, hey, here's some, charcuterie plate for your meal, you'd feel like, oh yeah, I'm ready for that. Sounds great. It's based that your stomach starts to feel hungry. It's patient. You don't have the anxious, I need to eat something right now feeling. It's a physical need and it involves a deliberate choice in what I'm going to eat. It's not like, I'll just eat anything. I don't care what's in front of me. And it stops when you're satiated, not when you're physically full. And it helps you eat only when necessary. But when the food is above the brain, the food cravings above the brain, it's an emotional food feeling. It's sudden. It's usually for like a specific food. Like, I really want some chips right now. I really need something like that. It's above the neck, so it's all brain. It's all like this crazy need I have. It's not patient, it's like urgent. It's anxious, it's anxiety provoking. And it's usually paired with like a negative emotion, like I'm not feeling great. I had a hard day at work. I need a Starbucks. And it doesn't stop when you're full. it just like, or when you're satiated, it just keeps going. Like your belly has to only be able to feel all the carbohydrates in your stomach. And when you're overfull is when you stop. And usually at the end of a large carbohydrate meal, people feel pretty guilty and they actually feel regretful because they get sleepy. And that's kind of like your body's way of saying, like, you ate too much. It's not okay to eat like that. Don't do that again. And so, food coma or that sluggish, sleepy feeling after eating meals is not normal. You really shouldn't be eating what you did if you have a food coma. So, how do you get through this? Really, it's all about understanding that choice point and saying no to sugar and processed food because that is the number one reason why people have sugar cravings. Now, all these processed foods, these food chemists and big food have actually created focus groups of people where they actually measured all of the dopamine levels of certain variations of recipes of food that cause the highest dopamine spike. It's called the bliss point. So they're looking for the highest dopamine levels in someone's circulation. And then that's the recipe they use in order to market and sell different processed foods like chips. That's why chips are like so addictive because they've actually been modified and their recipe has been changed to create the highest dopamine spike in your body. And so that refined carbohydrate and sugar causes high dopamine levels that really, really messes up with our addiction pathways. And really just think like, I don't eat this. I don't eat like this because if I do, I know what's going to happen to me. And sometimes the effects are immediate, like the Randall cycle, like the sleepiness after meals. And sometimes it's long term and actually can lead to chronic disease. And so have a good support system. Continue with my YouTube channels. Like, reach out to me in your comments, reach out to, with Facebook groups that are supporting your goals. Find people that are willing to be an accountability partner and really find ways to boost your serotonin. Remember, your serotonin levels will go up with exercise, going outside, stress management, and the right sleep cycle. So, can you give me some other ways to boost your serotonin? How do you manage these cravings? Because these things will lead to serious food addiction, which is real. And there's actually wonderful resources. Dr. Joan Iflin is a lead researcher and expert in food addiction, processed food addiction. And she's created like an AA style, like sponsor style interventional program that where people start feeling addicted to certain foods, they can jump on her food addiction site website, a focus group, and find support to help people move away from processed foods because it is an addiction, just like alcoholism, where people call their sponsor when they're feeling like they have a alcohol craving. People can jump on to the food addiction group to help with their cravings as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. It's the third of the four in the series of conscious motherhood to help reduce pregnancy complications. Thank you so much.